Now, for a slightly obscure detail, while pig's blood was commonly mentioned, some sources suggest that the blood of other sacrificial animals, like goats or sheep, might also have been used, depending on availability and regional customs. The specific type of grain used could also vary, from millet to barley or even wheat. This suggests a degree of experimentation and adaptation, with bakers using whatever resources were at hand to achieve the desired leavening effect. It's a reminder that ancient recipes were rarely standardized in the way we think of them today. They were often fluid, adaptable, and based on local ingredients. It's like your grandma's recipe for cookies. She might use walnuts one day and pecans the next, depending on what's in the pantry. This brings us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the precise internal temperature of Roman ovens and the consistency of the heat distribution. Without modern thermometers, how did bakers ensure uniform baking? Was some bread consistently under or over-baked? While we know the general design of their ovens, the nuances of their operation, and the skill required to manage such intense heat, remain subjects of ongoing study. It's like trying to figure out the exact cooking time for a dish using only a vague description and no timer. You see, for all their engineering marvels, their aqueducts, their mighty legions, and their incredible roads, the Romans had a surprisingly tough time with something as seemingly simple as making bread rise. We're talking about a civilization that built entire cities, conquered vast empires, and yet, for a long, long time, their daily bread was more akin to a dense, flat, jaw-aching brick than the fluffy, airy loaves we cherish today. It's a bit like building a rocket to the moon, but forgetting how to tie your shoelaces. A hilarious, if somewhat inconvenient, oversight. The types of bread produced in Roman bakeries varied significantly, reflecting the social hierarchy and culinary preferences of the time. The common people, the plebeians, would have consumed panis plebeius, a darker, coarser bread made from less refined flour, often a mix of wheat and barley. This was the workhorse bread, the daily sustenance that fueled their lives. It was nutritious, filling, and affordable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world you're listening from. For the wealthier citizens, there was panis candidatus, or white bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour. This was a luxury, a symbol of status and refinement. Its lighter color and finer texture were highly prized, reflecting the effort and expense involved in producing such refined flour. You can imagine the Roman elite delicately breaking off a piece of their white bread, perhaps dipping it in olive oil or a rich sauce, while the common folk chewed on their denser, darker loaves. It's a bit like the difference between your everyday sandwich bread and a fancy brioche. Both are bread, but one definitely says, "I've arrived." Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Beyond these staples, there were also specialized breads. Panis artilaganus was a finer, lighter bread, sometimes enriched with milk, eggs, or even honey, often served at banquets. There were breads for soldiers, designed for durability and portability. There were even breads for specific religious rituals, sometimes shaped into symbolic forms. The Roman bakery was a versatile institution, capable of producing a wide array of products to meet the diverse demands of its society. You close your eyes, and the world shifts. The soft glow of your bedside lamp fades, replaced by the flickering light of an oil lamp in a modest Roman kitchen. You're not quite a Roman citizen, more like an unseen observer, a whisper in the past. The air is thick with the earthy scent of grain, a smell that speaks of sustenance, of life itself. But it's not the warm, yeasty aroma of fresh-baked bread you might be imagining. No, this is the raw, unadulterated smell of flour, perhaps a little damp, a little coarse, mixed with the faint tang of, well, just water. The Roman baking industry was not just about making bread, it was also a significant employer. It provided livelihoods for millers, bakers, oven tenders, and distributors. It was a vital part of the urban economy, ensuring that the vast populations of Roman cities had access to their most fundamental foodstuff. The baker, once a humble producer, became a respected, if hard-working, member of society. In these earliest days of Rome, long before the grandeur of the Colosseum or the intricate plumbing of the public baths, the diet of the average Roman was remarkably simple, almost austere. Your ancestors, if they were living here, would have been intimately familiar with poles, a thick, hearty porridge made from grains like spelt or emmer. Think of it as the original Roman comfort food, the bedrock of their diet, consumed morning, noon, and night. You'd be stirring it over an open flame, the steam rising, warming your face, and the rhythmic scrape of the wooden spoon against the earthenware pot would be the soundtrack to your evening. It was filling, certainly, but hardly a culinary delight. It was survival. You could almost hear the sounds of the Roman street outside the bakery, the rumble of carts, the chatter of vendors, the distant shouts of children playing, and permeating it all, the irresistible aroma of fresh-baked bread, a scent that would draw people in, a promise of warmth and sustenance. It's a powerful reminder of how central bread was to their daily existence, not just as food, but as a cultural cornerstone. But as Rome grew, as its people ventured further, traded more, and their palates became a little more refined, the desire for something more substantial, something you could hold in your hand and carry, began to emerge. The idea of bread, a solid, portable form of their beloved grain, started to take root. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief at the thought of not having to slurp down porridge for every single meal. Imagine the convenience, no more messy bowls, just a neat, compact disc of grain. So, the next time you bite into a perfectly risen slice of bread, take a moment to appreciate the journey it took to get there. From accidental fermentation to the deliberate harnessing of beer yeast, and even the unsettling use of animal blood. The Romans pushed the boundaries of what was possible, all in the pursuit of a better loaf. Their bakeries were places of innovation, hard work, and the constant striving for culinary improvement. The transition, however, was far from smooth. You see, transforming a bowl of mush into a firm, edible loaf is a bit of a leap, especially when you lack the fundamental understanding of what makes dough light and airy. Early Roman bread was, by all accounts, a formidable challenge to consume. Picture a flat, dense disc, heavy in your hand, with a texture that would give your jaw a serious workout. It was often baked directly on hot stones or under ashes, resulting in a product that was more akin to a hardtack biscuit or a very thick, unleavened cracker. You'd break off a piece, perhaps dip it in olive oil or a thin broth, and chew and chew and chew. Your teeth would ache, your jaw would protest, and you'd probably spend half your meal trying to moisten the thing enough to swallow it without choking. It was functional. Yes, a vehicle for other foods, but certainly not a joy to eat on its own. It makes you appreciate your soft, fluffy sandwich bread, doesn't it? You probably wouldn't survive a week on this stuff. The Roman Empire was vast, and its culinary traditions, including bread making, weren't uniform across all its territories. As the empire expanded, so too did the exchange of ideas and techniques. How did these diverse regions adapt and diversify their bread making, incorporating local ingredients and customs? You're about to explore the regional variations that made Roman bread a truly imperial affair. This dense, unyielding bread was a far cry from the light, airy loaves that would eventually become synonymous with Roman culinary prowess. It was a testament to their sheer determination, a reflection of a society that valued practicality and sustenance above all else. But even the most stoic Roman must have yearned for something a little less laborious. The desire for a bread that was easier to chew, more digestible, and simply more pleasant to eat was a quiet, unspoken ambition. It wasn't just about taste, it was about efficiency, about making the most of every calorie, and about the sheer comfort of a softer bite after a long day of, say, building an aqueduct or marching for miles in heavy armor. You've explored the bustling Roman bakery, seen the immense effort involved, and even glimpsed the strange ingredients that made their bread rise. But the Roman Empire, as you know, wasn't a single, uniform entity. It was a vast tapestry of cultures, climates, and resources. Stretching from the cold, damp lands of Britannia to the sun-drenched deserts of Egypt. And just as the empire absorbed and adapted various customs, so too did its culinary traditions, especially bread making, evolve and diversify across its immense territories. So, how did they try to improve this culinary brick? In these nascent stages, their methods were rudimentary, often based on accidental observations rather than scientific understanding. You might see a baker, perhaps a slave or a freedman, leaving a portion of dough out overnight, hoping some magic would happen. And sometimes a little bit did. The air, teeming with unseen microbes, would interact with the dough, initiating a slow, unpredictable fermentation. This was the earliest, most primitive form of what we now understand as sourdough. They didn't know about yeast, about single-celled fungi feasting on sugars and expelling carbon dioxide. They just knew that sometimes, if you were lucky, and the temperature was just right, and the stars aligned, that old, neglected lump of dough would develop a faint tang. And when mixed with fresh flour, it would produce a slightly less dense loaf. A tiny, almost imperceptible improvement, but an improvement nonetheless. Imagine yourself now not in the heart of Rome, but traveling across the empire, a silent observer of its diverse landscapes and kitchens. The common historical fact here is that the Roman Empire's vastness led to significant regional variations in bread making, influenced by local grain availability, climate, and cultural traditions. What was considered bread in one province might be quite different from another. A testament to the adaptability of Roman ingenuity. You watch as a baker, his brow furrowed with concentration, kneads a massive batch of dough. His muscles ripple under his tunic as he pushes and pulls, folds and presses. The dough is stiff, resistant, a testament to the sheer physical effort involved in Roman bread making. There are no fancy stand mixers here, no electric ovens, just raw human power and the heat of a wood-fired hearth. The common historical fact here is undeniable. The Roman diet was overwhelmingly grain-based, and bread, in its various forms, quickly became the cornerstone of their daily sustenance. It was the fuel that powered their empire, the caloric backbone of their legions, and the staple that fed their growing cities. Let's start in the Fertile Crescent of Egypt, often called the breadbasket of Rome. Here, the climate was ideal for growing emmer and durum wheat, which yielded a coarser but nutritious flour. You'd see bakers in Alexandria, perhaps influenced by ancient Egyptian traditions, using a form of sourdough that had been perfected over millennia. Remember that accidental fermentation we talked about? The Egyptians had been doing it for ages, long before the Romans even existed. Their bread might have been denser than the finer loaves of Rome, but it was hearty, sustaining, and produced in enormous quantities, shipped across the Mediterranean to feed the imperial capital. You can almost feel the dry, warm air, the faint scent of baking bread mingling with the aroma of spices from distant lands. As you observe, you notice a small, almost insignificant detail. The baker, after a particularly long and arduous kneading session, wipes his hands on a coarse linen cloth. But before he does, he scrapes a tiny bit of the old leftover dough, the stuff that's been sitting around for a day or two, perhaps even longer into the new batch. It's a habit, passed down through generations, a ritual born of trial and error. This is the obscure detail the earliest Roman bakers unknowingly practiced a form of backslopping, using residual fermented dough to kickstart new batches, long before the science of leavening was understood. They weren't thinking about yeast cultures or enzymatic reactions. They were simply trying to make their lives, and their bread, a little bit easier. It's a fascinating glimpse into the empirical nature of ancient innovation. Now, journey west to Gaul, modern-day France. Here, the Romans encountered Celtic tribes who had a long tradition of brewing beer. And what did we learn about beer? That frothy, yeasty byproduct in Gaul? The use of beer yeast for leavening bread was particularly prevalent, as Pliny the Elder noted. You'd see bakers here using the abundant supply of brewer's foam to create lighter, more palatable loaves. The bread might have had a slightly different flavor profile, perhaps a subtle malty note from the beer, but it would have been a welcome change from the denser, unleavened varieties. It's like discovering that the local craft brewery also makes amazing pretzels, a delightful regional specialty. Yet, despite these small steps, the quest for truly risen bread remained largely unfulfilled. The loaves were still heavy, still prone to going stale quickly, and still a challenge for anyone with less than perfect teeth. The Roman appetite for improvement, however, was insatiable. They were a people who constantly sought to optimize, to build, to refine. And this desire for a better loaf of bread, a softer, more palatable bread, would eventually lead them down a truly unexpected path. Move further north to Britannia, a colder, wetter land. Here, the grains might have been different, perhaps more barley or oats, which are harder to work with for a light, airy loaf. The bakers in Roman Britannia would have faced unique challenges. Their bread might have been even denser, more akin to a rustic, whole-grain loaf, or perhaps relying more heavily on long-fermented sourdoughs due to the cooler temperatures. Imagine a Roman legionary, shivering in the damp British air, grateful for a warm, if somewhat heavy, a piece of bread. It's a far cry from the refined white bread of Rome, but it served its purpose. You might wonder, what exactly was the typical grain they used? While wheat would eventually become dominant, particularly the softer varieties suitable for finer flour. Early Roman bread often relied on spelt and emmer. These ancient grains are robust, hardy, and yield a dense flour. Imagine trying to make a light, fluffy cake with whole wheat flour. It's a challenge. Right now, imagine doing it without any chemical leavening or even a reliable yeast source. It's a testament to their resilience that they managed to make anything edible at all. This brings us to a slightly obscure detail in some regions, particularly those with strong agricultural traditions. Specific local ingredients were sometimes incorporated into bread for flavor or texture. For instance, in parts of Italy, chestnuts might have been ground into flour, or olives and herbs might have been added to the dough. In coastal areas, you might find bread made with seawater, which would have subtly altered the flavor and texture. These regional variations were not just about necessity, they were about culinary identity, a reflection of the unique bounty of each province. It's like how different regions of Italy have their own unique pasta shapes, same core ingredient, but endless variations. This brings us to a point of ongoing scholarly discussion. Historians still debate the precise timeline of when different leavening methods became widespread in Roman society. Was it a gradual evolution, or were there specific breakthroughs that accelerated the process? The archaeological record, while rich in artifacts, doesn't always provide clear answers about daily culinary practices. We find ovens, grinding stones, and even remnants of bread. But piecing together the exact steps of their baking process, particularly the nuances of fermentation, remains a complex puzzle. It's a bit like trying to reverse engineer your grandmother's secret recipe just by looking at the crumbs on the counter. Consider the climate. In hotter regions, fermentation would have occurred much faster, requiring bakers to work quickly or use cooler methods. In colder areas, dough would have needed more time to rise, perhaps requiring heated rooms or longer fermentation periods. The Roman baker was a master of adaptation, constantly adjusting their techniques to the local environment. Much like a modern chef adapts a recipe to the availability of seasonal ingredients, the Roman fascination with bread wasn't just about sustenance, it was also about status. While the common folk ate their dense, dark loaves, the wealthy elite began to demand something finer, something lighter, something that reflected their elevated position in society. Imagine hosting a grand banquet and serving your esteemed guests a loaf that could double as a doorstop. It simply wouldn't do. This demand for a superior product fueled the innovation, pushing bakers to experiment, to observe, and to perhaps stumble upon something truly revolutionary. This leads us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the extent of knowledge transfer and cross-pollination of baking techniques across the Roman Empire. Did bakers from one region travel to another, sharing their secrets? Were there imperial directives on bread production? Or was it largely left to local innovation? While we know that ideas spread, the precise mechanisms and speed of this culinary diffusion remain subjects of scholarly discussion. It's like trying to trace the exact origin of a popular meme. It spreads widely, but pinpointing the first instance can be tricky. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from the early Roman bakers. Why won't this dough just lift? They might have muttered, wiping sweat from their brows. They tried everything within their limited understanding. More water, less water. More kneading, less kneading. Different types of grain, different baking temperatures. Yet, the results were stubbornly consistent, dense, flat, and heavy. It was a universal problem, one that plagued every household and every bakery across the nascent Roman Republic. The concept of light and fluffy was a distant dream, a whispered hope in the smoky confines of their kitchens. The Roman military also played a significant role in the spread of bread-making techniques. As legions marched across the empire, they brought their culinary traditions with them. Roman military camps often had their own bakeries, ensuring a consistent supply of bread for the soldiers. These military bakers would have introduced Roman methods and ingredients to new territories, influencing local baking practices. Imagine a Roman soldier, far from home, craving a taste of familiar bread, and the local baker learning new tricks from the legion's camp. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. And in the case of Roman bread, the necessity for something better, something less like a jawbreaker and more like a meal, would eventually lead them to a discovery that was, by modern standards, incredibly strange. A life hack, if you will, that seems utterly bizarre to us today, but which, for the Romans, was a game changer. It transformed their daily bread from a chore into something approaching a pleasure, a small luxury in a world of hard work and simple fare. The types of grain available also dictated the kind of bread produced. While wheat was highly prized, especially durum wheat for fine flour, other grains like barley, millet, and oats were also widely cultivated and used for bread, particularly in areas where wheat was less abundant. This meant a diverse array of textures and flavors, from dense, dark barley loaves to lighter, whiter wheat breads. The Roman diet, while often perceived as uniform, was in fact rich in regional culinary diversity. The stage is set. The problem is clear: how do you make bread rise without understanding the science of yeast? The answer, as you'll soon discover, involves a surprising detour into another ancient Roman industry, one that seems completely unrelated to baking. It's a testament to the interconnectedness of ancient life, where resources were repurposed, and ingenuity often arose from unexpected combinations. For now, you just feel the weight of that dense, unyielding loaf in your imaginary hand, and you wonder, how on earth did they ever figure it out? The answer, my friend, is stranger than you think. You can imagine the sensory experience of walking through a Roman market in a provincial town. The air would be filled with the scent of different breads, the earthy aroma of a local barley loaf, the slightly sour tang of a sourdough from a nearby farm, and perhaps the familiar yeasty smell of a loaf made with beer foam, a taste of Rome in a distant land. Each loaf would tell a story of its origin, its ingredients, and the hands that shaped it. You're still there, aren't you? Standing in that smoky Roman kitchen, the faint, unappetizing scent of dense, unleavened dough clinging to the air. You've felt the sheer, unyielding weight of that early Roman bread, a culinary challenge more than a delight. The question hangs heavy in the air, just like the flour dust. How did they ever move beyond that? How did they stumble upon the secrets that would eventually transform their jaw-aching bricks into something, anything, a little more palatable? The demand for bread was constant. Regardless of the region, it was the fundamental foodstuff, the caloric backbone of daily life. And so, bakers across the empire, whether they were using traditional sourdough, the frothy byproduct of beer, or even the unsettling fermented blood paste, were united in their mission to provide sustenance to the vast and diverse population of the Roman world. The answer, like many great discoveries in history, wasn't a sudden flash of genius, but rather a slow, meandering journey paved with accidental observations and fortunate coincidences. Imagine yourself as a Roman baker, perhaps a bit tired, a bit frustrated, and certainly not a microbiologist. You're just trying to get through the day, kneading endless batches of that stubborn dough. You're probably not thinking about single-celled organisms or carbon dioxide. You're thinking about your aching back and the hungry mouths waiting for their daily ration. So, the next time you consider the Roman Empire, it's remember that its culinary landscape was as varied and complex as its political one. From the granaries of Egypt to the breweries of Gaul, Roman bread evolved, adapted, and diversified. A testament to the ingenuity of its people and the enduring power of a simple loaf. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time, far, far away from your comfy bed and the hum of your modern life, to a place where the scent of baking bread filled the air, but perhaps not in the way you'd expect. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of ancient Rome. The sun beats down on cobblestones. The murmur of 1,000 voices drifts through the air. And somewhere in a smoky, bustling bakery, a Roman baker is wrestling with a lump of dough. But this isn't your artisanal sourdough, oh no. This is something far more challenging. Now we've talked a lot about the how, the strange ingredients and the bustling bakeries. But what about the why? What was actually happening at a microscopic level that made these bizarre methods work? You're about to delve into the unseen world of yeast, the tiny architects that silently transformed Roman bread, long before anyone even knew they existed. In this world, where science as we know it is centuries away, learning happens through sheer repetition and keen observation. You'd notice things. Perhaps a batch of dough left uncovered near a brewing vat seemed to behave differently. Maybe a portion of old dough, accidentally mixed into a new one, yielded a slightly less leaden result. It was a process of trial and error, punctuated by countless failures and the occasional bewildering success. Think of it like trying to fix a leaky faucet with a hammer. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you just make a bigger mess. But every now and then, you hit something just right. You've traveled across the Roman Empire, from the bustling bakeries of Rome to the diverse culinary landscapes of Egypt, Gaul, and Britannia. You've seen the immense effort, the strange ingredients, and the regional adaptations that shaped Roman bread. But through all these observations, there's been an unseen force at play, a silent architect working behind the scenes, transforming dense dough into something lighter and more palatable. This force, this microscopic marvel, is yeast. And now we're going to shrink down, way down, to understand the hidden biological processes that made the Roman bread hack work so well, long before anyone even knew what a microbe was. One of the most fundamental accidental discoveries revolved around the very air you breathe. You see, the air in ancient Rome, just like the air around you right now, was teeming with microscopic life, invisible to the naked eye. Wild yeast floated on every breeze, settled on every surface. When you left a mixture of flour and water exposed, these tiny organisms would inevitably land in it. They'd find a cozy new home, a buffet of carbohydrates, and they'd get to work. As they feasted, they'd produce gases, the very same gases that make your modern bread rise. Imagine yourself now, not as an observer of grand Roman scenes, but as a tiny, invisible entity, floating amidst the flour dust in a Roman bakery. You land softly on a lump of freshly kneaded dough. To your microscopic eyes, this dough isn't just a lump, it's a vast, intricate landscape of starch molecules, water, and proteins. And scattered throughout this landscape, like tiny, industrious workers, are the single-celled fungi we call yeast. You can almost picture it a Roman baker. Perhaps a young apprentice forgets a small bowl of dough in a warm corner of the bakery. Days pass. The dough, instead of simply molding, starts to bubble. A faint, slightly sour smell emerges. Not entirely unpleasant, but certainly different. When this spoiled dough is reluctantly mixed into a fresh batch, something miraculous happens. The new dough, instead of remaining stubbornly flat, begins to swell, to puff up ever so slightly. It's not a dramatic rise, not the kind you see with commercial yeast today, but it's enough to make a noticeable difference. The resulting bread, while still dense by our standards, is a revelation. It's softer, chewier, and perhaps even a little tangy. It's a small victory, but one that would echo through the centuries. The common historical fact here is that the existence and role of microorganisms like yeast were completely unknown to the Romans, as they lacked microscopes and the scientific understanding of microbiology. They observed the effects of fermentation, the bubbling, the rising, the change in flavor, but they attributed it to natural processes, divine intervention, or simply the inherent spirit of the dough. It's a bit like knowing that flicking a light switch turns on a light, but having no idea about electricity, circuits, or power plants. The outcome is clear, the mechanism, a complete mystery. This accidental process, the cultivation of what we now call a sourdough starter, was likely the earliest form of leavening. It wasn't intentional, not at first. It was a happy accident, a byproduct of leaving things out, of not being quite meticulous enough with your cleaning. It's like finding a $20 bill in an old coat pocket, a pleasant surprise born of forgetfulness. The common historical fact here is that sourdough, or naturally leavened bread, predates the isolation and commercial production of yeast by millennia. Civilizations across the globe, from ancient Egypt to Rome, independently stumbled upon this magical transformation. So, what were these invisible architects actually doing when a Roman baker added a bit of sourdough starter, a scoop of beer foam, or even that unsettling fermented blood paste to their dough? They were, unknowingly, introducing millions, if not billions, of living yeast cells. Once these yeast cells found themselves in the warm, moist, and carbohydrate-rich environment of the dough, they got to work. Their primary goal, from a biological perspective, was to eat and reproduce. The Romans, being practical people, would have quickly learned to harness this phenomenon. They wouldn't understand the science, but they would understand the results. Keep a bit of the old dough, they'd instruct. It makes the new dough lighter. This practice, which we touched on in the last part, the backslopping method, became a cornerstone of their early baking. You'd see a small lump of the previous day's dough, carefully preserved, perhaps even pampered, ready to be kneaded into the next batch. It was their secret weapon, their culinary heirloom, passed down from one generation of bakers to the next, their favorite food. The sugars in the flour? Flour, particularly wheat flour, contains complex carbohydrates, starches that are broken down into simpler sugars by enzymes naturally present in the flour and, crucially, by enzymes produced by the yeast itself. Once these sugars are available, the yeast cells begin a process called fermentation. Now, imagine the challenges. This wild yeast was temperamental. Its activity depended on temperature, humidity, and the specific strains of yeast floating in the air on any given day. Some days, your dough would rise beautifully. Other days, it would sit there, stubbornly flat, mocking your efforts. It was a gamble, a daily roll of the dice in the Roman bakery. You'd probably curse under your breath, wondering what you did wrong, when in reality, it was just the capricious nature of microscopic fungi. It makes you realize how easy we have it with those little packets of instant yeast, doesn't it? No more praying to the bread gods. Think of it like this: the yeast is having a feast. As they consume these sugars, they metabolize them for energy. And just like you exhale carbon dioxide after eating, yeast cells produce byproducts. The two main byproducts of this alcoholic fermentation? Yes, it's the same process that makes alcohol in beer and wine, our ethanol alcohol, and, more importantly for bread, carbon dioxide gas. This brings us to a fascinating, slightly obscure detail. Some Roman bakers may have intentionally introduced elements from their environment that they observed to be active into their dough. This wasn't just about leftover dough. Think about the surfaces in a Roman kitchen. Wooden kneading troughs, stone tables, even the very air near a thriving vineyard or a bustling brewery. These places would have been rich with wild yeast. It's plausible that a particularly observant baker might have scraped some residue from a wine press, or even from the bottom of a beer barrel, and added it to their dough, noticing an enhanced leavening effect. They wouldn't know why, of course, just that it worked. It's like when you accidentally drop your phone in water, and then it suddenly starts working better. You don't know why, but you're not complaining. You, as our tiny observer, would see these microscopic bubbles of carbon dioxide forming within the dough. As more and more gas is produced, these tiny bubbles expand, pushing against the elastic network of gluten in the dough. Gluten, formed when flour proteins are hydrated and kneaded, acts like a balloon, trapping these gas bubbles. This is the rise you see in bread. Without yeast or some other leavening agent producing gas, the dough would remain dense and flat, just like those early Roman bricks we discussed. This accidental introduction of yeast from other fermented products is a key part of the story. While we'll dive deeper into the beer connection in the next part, it's important to understand that the Romans were surrounded by fermentation. Their wine, their garum, that pungent fish sauce, even some of their medicines involved microbial activity. It was a world alive with unseen processes, and it was only natural that some of these processes would spill over into their bread making. The alcohol produced by the yeast largely evaporates during the baking process, leaving behind only the characteristic flavors and aromas that make bread so delicious. But it's the carbon dioxide that does the heavy lifting. Literally, making the dough light and airy. Consider the environment of a Roman bakery. It would have been warm, often humid from the ovens, and filled with the scent of flour and, eventually, fermenting dough. This was an ideal environment for yeast to thrive. The very air would have been a living, breathing starter culture. You'd walk in, and the subtle tang of fermentation would hit you. A smell that meant work was being done, that bread was on its way. It's a smell that, for for us might conjure images of a quaint artisan bakery. But for them, it was just the smell of daily life. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, different strains of wild yeast and bacteria, naturally present in sourdough starters or beer foam, contributed unique flavor profiles to Roman bread. While Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the common baker's yeast, was likely present, sourdough starters also contain various lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid as byproducts of their own fermentation, contributing to the characteristic tangy flavor of sourdough bread. So, when a Roman baker used a sourdough starter, they weren't just getting a rise, they were also getting a complex symphony of flavors that varied depending on the specific microbial community in their starter. It's like having a secret ingredient that changes subtly with every batch, making each loaf a unique experience. The consistency of the flour also played a significant role. Early Roman milling techniques were crude. Grains were ground between stones, often leaving behind a coarse, uneven flour with bits of bran and germ. While this made for a nutritious product, it also meant that the gluten structure essential for trapping those precious gas bubbles was less developed. Even with active yeast, a coarse flour would yield a denser loaf. It's like trying to blow up a balloon made of sandpaper. It's just not going to hold the air as well. Consider the conditions. The Roman baker, unknowingly, was a master of creating the perfect environment for these microscopic workers. Warmth from the ovens encouraged yeast activity. The humidity in the bakery kept the dough from drying out, allowing the yeast to thrive. Even the type of flour used, coarser grains or finer ones, would influence how quickly the sugars were available and how effectively the gluten could trap the gas. It was a delicate balance, often achieved through generations of trial and error rather than scientific understanding. This leads us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars continue to discuss the extent to which specific Roman regions or social classes developed distinct leavening techniques. Did the sophisticated bakers of Rome itself have more advanced methods than those in a distant provincial town? Was there a secret recipe for the emperor's bread that differed significantly from the common soldier's ration? The archaeological evidence and surviving texts offer tantalizing clues, but rarely provide definitive answers. It's a bit like trying to figure out if your neighbor's grandmother's cookie recipe is truly unique, or if everyone in her town just made them that way. This leads us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the specific dominant strains of yeast and bacteria present in ancient Roman leavening agents. Without preserved samples that can be genetically analyzed, it's impossible to know the exact microbial makeup of their sourdough starters or beer yeasts. Modern attempts to recreate ancient breads often rely on educated guesses and the use of modern wild yeasts, but the precise flavors and textures of Roman bread remain somewhat elusive. It's like trying to perfectly replicate a historical perfume without knowing the exact proportions of its ingredients. You can get close, Wang, but the true essence might be lost to time. The Roman fascination with bread was not just about making it rise, it was also about making it last. In a world without refrigeration, food preservation was paramount. A dense, unleavened bread might have lasted longer, making it suitable for soldiers on campaign or for storage during lean times. But a softer, more palatable bread, even if it had a shorter shelf life, would have been a welcome luxury. The tension between practicality and pleasure was a constant undercurrent in their culinary evolution. The Romans also understood, on a practical level, the importance of feeding their leavening agents. A sourdough starter, for instance, needed to be regularly refreshed with new flour and water to keep the yeast and bacteria active. This practice, known as feeding the starter, ensured a continuous supply of active leavening. They might not have known why it worked, but they knew that a well-fed starter produced better bread. It's like knowing your car needs gas to run, even if you don't understand internal combustion. You can imagine the conversations amongst Roman bakers, sharing tips and tricks, perhaps exaggerating their successes and downplaying their failures. My latest batch rose almost a finger's width. One might boast, while another grumbles about his stone loaves. It was a craft, an art form, and a constant learning process. They were the unsung heroes of the Roman diet, tirelessly working to feed an ever-growing population. The use of beer yeast, as we discussed, was a significant step forward because it provided a more concentrated and consistent source of active yeast. The brewing process naturally selected for robust, fast-acting yeast strains. When bakers used this byproduct, they were essentially getting a pre-activated, high-performance leavening agent. This allowed for more predictable and faster rises, leading to more consistent bread production. It was their version of instant yeast, centuries before the real thing existed. The accidental discoveries of fermentation were not unique to Rome. Across the ancient world, people were making fermented beverages and foods, often without understanding the underlying biology. The Egyptians, for instance, were renowned for their bread and beer, and it's highly probable that their bread-making benefited from the byproducts of their brewing. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, were adept at adopting and adapting ideas from other cultures. It's not a stretch to imagine them observing practices in conquered lands and incorporating them into their own culinary repertoire. Even the unsettling use of fermented blood paste, while seemingly bizarre, tapped into the same biological principles. The blood, rich in nutrients, provided an excellent medium for yeast and bacteria to grow. The fermentation of the grain within the blood would have produced carbon dioxide, leading to leavening. While the sensory experience might have been unique, the underlying microbial process was fundamentally the same. It's a testament to the universality of fermentation. So, while the early Roman bread was a formidable challenge, the seeds of improvement were sown through simple observation and the unpredictable magic of wild yeast. It was a slow, incremental process, a series of tiny steps forward, each one making their daily loaf a little less of a chore and a little more of a comfort. The journey from dense pulls to a lighter, more enjoyable bread was a testament to their perseverance and their willingness to experiment, even if those experiments were often accidental. The Roman baker, therefore, was not just a craftsman. They were, unknowingly, a master of applied microbiology. They nurtured invisible cultures, understood the subtle signs of fermentation, and harnessed the power of microscopic life to create one of the most fundamental foodstuffs of their civilization. Their success wasn't due to scientific knowledge, but to keen observation, relentless experimentation, and a deep, intuitive understanding of their ingredients. The stage is now set for the next, even stranger chapter in the Roman bread story. They've discovered that something somehow makes dough lighter. But how do you control it? How do you make it consistent? And what truly bizarre ingredient did they eventually turn to? One that seems utterly unrelated to baking, to achieve the perfect rise you're about to find out. And trust me, it's not what you'd expect. You can imagine the subtle changes in the dough as the yeast worked the faint bubbling, the gradual expansion, the shift in aroma from raw flour to a sweet, yeasty tang. These were the signs that the unseen architects were busy, transforming the humble ingredients into something magnificent. It was a daily miracle, repeated in thousands of bakeries across the empire. You're still feeling that slight tang in the air, aren't you? That subtle, almost imperceptible hint of fermentation that lingered from the last part. A whisper of the wild yeast that were beginning to transform Roman baking. You've seen how accidental discoveries and careful observation led them to the rudimentary concept of a sourdough starter. But while that was a step forward, it was still inconsistent, still a bit of a gamble. The Romans, ever practical, needed something more reliable, something they could control. And this is where our story takes an unexpected, and frankly, quite boozy turn. So, the next time you enjoy the airy texture of a fresh loaf, remember the invisible workers within. And remember the Roman bakers, who, without a single microscope or a scientific textbook, intuitively understood and harnessed the power of yeast to feed an empire. Their strange life hacks were, in essence, early experiments in microbiology, driven by the simple, universal desire for a better bite. Imagine yourself now not in a bakery, but in a Roman tavern or capona. The air is thick with the smell of stale wine, a faint whiff of roasted meat, and the unmistakable earthy aroma of beer? Yes, beer. While wine was the drink of choice for the Roman elite and a staple for many, beer, or cervisia, was also widely consumed, especially in the northern provinces and among the working classes. It was often a thicker, cloudier brew than what you might be used to, more akin to a liquid bread than a crisp lager. You'd see patrons clinking earthenware mugs, their faces flushed, their voices growing louder as the evening wore on. It was a place of camaraderie, of gossip, and, as it turns out, of accidental culinary innovation. We've explored the hidden world of yeast and how it silently shaped Roman bread. Now, let's zoom back out and consider the broader impact. How did the consistent production of risen bread reshape daily life, economy, and even the social fabric of ancient Rome? You're about to see how a simple loaf of bread could transform an entire civilization. The brewing process in ancient Rome, much like their early bread making, was largely empirical. They didn't have thermometers or hydrometers. They just knew that if you steeped grain in hot water, added some kind of fermenting agent, often leftover dregs from a previous batch, and let it sit, you'd eventually get an intoxicating beverage. And crucially, a byproduct of this fermentation was a thick, frothy layer that collected on top of the brewing vats. This was the brewer's yeast, and a potent, active source of the very microorganisms that made dough rise. You've peered into the microscopic world of yeast, witnessing the invisible architects at work, transforming humble flour and water into something light and airy. You now understand the why behind the Roman bread hack, even if the Romans themselves didn't. But the impact of this newfound consistency in bread making extended far beyond the confines of the bakery. It rippled through every aspect of Roman society, reshaping daily life, fueling the economy, and even influencing the social fabric of an entire civilization. Now, imagine a Roman baker, perhaps a particularly observant one, or maybe just a baker who also enjoyed a pint or two after a long day. He's seen this frothy stuff, this spuma or foam, bubbling away in the brewery. He knows it's active, that it's somehow responsible for the intoxicating kick of the beer. And he's still struggling with his stubbornly flat bread. A thought sparks. What if this active foam, this byproduct of beer, could be used to help his dough? It's a leap, certainly. A cross-disciplinary culinary experiment born of desperation and curiosity. It's like using your car's engine to power your blender. Completely unrelated. But hey, if it works. So he tries it. You watch as he carefully scoops a handful of this yeasty foam from the top of a brewing vat. It's sticky, pungent, and probably smells a bit like an old brewery floor. He carries it back to his bakery, a small, precious cargo. With a mixture of hope and trepidation, he kneads this strange, beer-scented substance into a fresh batch of flour and water. He waits, and then, slowly, miraculously, the dough begins to swell. Not just a little, but significantly. The rise is more consistent, more predictable than anything he's achieved with his temperamental sourdough starter. The resulting bread is lighter, airier, and far more palatable. It's a game changer. This, my friends, is the surprising connection the Romans discovered that the foam and dregs from beer brewing could be used as a highly effective leavening agent for bread. This is a common historical fact, often overlooked, but profoundly important in the history of baking. It was a symbiotic relationship. The brewery provided the yeast, and the bakery, in turn, produced a better product. It was an early example of industrial synergy, long before anyone even knew what industry meant. The common historical fact here is that bread became the undisputed staple food across all social classes in the Roman Empire, and its consistent availability and improved quality were crucial for sustaining its vast population. From the poorest laborer to the wealthiest senator, bread was the foundation of their diet. It was cheap, nutritious, and with the advent of reliable leavening, increasingly enjoyable. This widespread consumption meant that the demand for bread was immense and constant, driving the growth of a sophisticated baking industry. This method, using what was essentially a waste product from brewing, was far more reliable than relying on wild yeast floating in the air or the unpredictable nature of a sourdough starter. The yeast from beer was cultivated, concentrated, and consistently active. It meant that Roman bakers could produce lighter, more consistent loaves day after day, regardless of the ambient conditions. It was a shift from hoping for a rise to actively making it happen. Think about the Roman legions, marching across vast distances, conquering new territories. A soldier's ration often consisted primarily of grain, which they would grind and bake themselves. Imagine the morale boost of a consistently lighter, more digestible loaf after a long, arduous march, compared to a dense, stomach-churning brick. Improved bread meant better fed, more energetic soldiers, which directly contributed to the military might and expansion of the Roman Empire. It's like upgrading your army from marching on empty stomachs to marching on power bars, a significant tactical advantage. Think about the impact this would have had. Suddenly, bread wasn't just a dense caloric delivery system, it was becoming a more enjoyable food in its own right. Imagine the relief of a Roman citizen biting into a relatively soft, airy loaf after a lifetime of chewing on bricks. It would have been a small, daily luxury, a moment of genuine pleasure. It's like finally upgrading from dial-up internet to fiber optic. The difference is monumental, even if you didn't realize how bad it was until you had something better. Economically, the consistent production of risen bread spurred significant growth and specialization. The demand for grain soared, leading to the development of vast agricultural estates, particularly in North Africa and Egypt, which became the granaries of Rome. This necessitated complex logistical networks for transporting grain across the Mediterranean, involving massive fleets of ships and efficient port operations. The baking industry itself became a major employer, providing livelihoods for millers, bakers, and distributors. It was a massive economic engine, all driven by the humble loaf. The use of beer yeast wasn't just practical, it also had economic implications. Breweries, particularly large ones, would have produced a significant amount of this yeasty byproduct. This waste product could now be sold or traded to bakers, creating a new economic link between two seemingly disparate industries. It was a win-win situation. Brewers had a new revenue stream, and bakers had a reliable source of leavening. This sort of resourcefulness was typical of the Romans, who were masters of efficiency and repurposing. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, the Roman government often implemented a system known as the annona, a public grain dole, which provided subsidized or free grain and sometimes bread to the urban poor in Rome. This policy was crucial for maintaining social stability and preventing unrest among the masses. The ability to consistently produce large quantities of palatable, risen bread made the annona far more effective. Imagine trying to appease a hungry populace with hardtack. It wouldn't have gone over well. The improved quality of bread, even for the poorest citizens, was a silent but powerful tool of imperial control and social welfare. It's like a modern government providing universal basic income, but in the form of delicious, fluffy bread. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, some Roman texts, like Pliny the Elder's Natural History, hint at the use of beer foam for leavening, but often without fully explaining the biological mechanism. Pliny, for instance, mentions that in Gaul and Spain, where beer was widely consumed, the foam which is skimmed off is used instead of yeast, and the bread made with it is lighter than that made in other ways. He observes the phenomenon, notes its effectiveness, but doesn't delve into the microscopic world of yeast. It's a bit like someone in the 18th century describing how a steam engine works by saying, "It makes things move because of hot air." Without understanding thermodynamics, they know what happens, but not why. This widespread availability and improved quality of bread also influenced Roman social dynamics. While the wealthy still enjoyed finer, whiter loaves, the fact that even the poor had access to consistently risen bread meant a baseline level of sustenance and comfort for everyone. Bread became a symbol of Roman civilization itself, a testament to its organizational capacity and its ability to feed its citizens. The baker, once a humble craftsman, gained a certain level of importance and respect within the community. This lack of scientific understanding, however, didn't diminish the practical application. The Romans were brilliant engineers and pragmatists. If something worked, they used it. The why was often less important than the how. And the how of using beer foam was simple, effective, and readily available. It transformed their baking industry, allowing for the production of a wider variety of breads, from the common daily loaf to the finer, whiter breads consumed by the wealthy. This leads us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the precise impact of bread quality on Roman public health and life expectancy. While better nutrition and easier digestion undoubtedly contributed to improved health, quantifying this impact is challenging due to the limited and often biased nature of ancient demographic data. Did softer bread lead to fewer dental issues? Did more digestible food reduce gastrointestinal ailments? These are questions that continue to intrigue historians and archaeologists. It's like trying to calculate the exact impact of a new health policy from centuries ago, with only fragmented records. This brings us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the exact composition and consistency of Roman beer yeast and how it varied regionally. Was the yeast from a Roman brewery in Gaul the same as one in Britannia or Italy? Did different types of grain used in brewing affect the quality of the yeast for baking? The answers are elusive, as ancient brewing recipes are often vague, and the specific strains of yeast would have varied wildly. It's like trying to recreate a historical cocktail without knowing the exact brand of spirits or the precise proportions. You can get close, but the nuances are lost to time. The consistent production of risen bread also fostered culinary innovation beyond the loaf itself. With a reliable base, Romans could experiment with new dishes, using bread as a vehicle for sauces, stews, and cheeses. The concept of dipping bread in olive oil or using it to sop up the juices of a meal became even more appealing with a softer, more absorbent product. It opened up new possibilities for the Roman kitchen, moving beyond mere sustenance to a more refined culinary experience. The Romans also experimented with other leavening agents, though none proved as consistently effective as beer yeast. They tried adding honey, which contains some wild yeasts, or even mixing in fermented grape must from wine production. But these methods were often less potent and less predictable. The beer yeast, with its concentrated and active cultures, was the clear winner. It was their secret weapon, the strange life hack that elevated their bread from merely edible to genuinely enjoyable. You can imagine the bustling Roman markets, where different types of bread would be sold alongside fruits, vegetables, and meats. The aroma of freshly baked bread would have been a constant, inviting presence, drawing people in. It was a sensory experience that defined the urban landscape, a testament to the vitality of Roman commerce and daily life. You can imagine the difference this made in daily life. A softer bread meant less wear and tear on teeth, especially important in a time before modern dentistry. It meant a more digestible food, easier on the stomach. And it meant a more versatile food, capable of soaking up stews, accompanying cheeses, or simply being enjoyed on its own. The humble loaf of bread, once a symbol of arduous sustenance, was now evolving into a culinary staple that brought a little more comfort and pleasure to the Roman table. The Roman fascination with bread was also reflected in their art and literature. Frescoes often depict scenes of bread making and consumption. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Cato the Elder discuss various types of bread and their uses. Bread was not just food, it was a cultural touchstone, deeply embedded in their rituals, their myths, and their everyday language. It was a symbol of prosperity, of civilization, and of the very fabric of Roman identity. The Roman bakeries themselves would have undergone a transformation. With a reliable source of leavening, they could scale up production. Larger ovens, more efficient kneading techniques, and a more standardized product became possible. The pastrinum, or bakery, became a vital part of every Roman town. A place where the scent of baking bread, now lighter and more inviting, would draw you in. You'd see the bakers, their faces dusted with flour, working tirelessly, but now with the added satisfaction of knowing their efforts would yield a superior product. The ability to produce bread consistently also meant greater food security. While famines and shortages still occurred, the efficient system of grain supply and bread production helped to mitigate their impact. A stable food supply was essential for maintaining order and preventing widespread unrest, particularly in the densely populated cities. The Roman state understood this implicitly, which is why the annona was such a critical policy. This shift also contributed to the professionalization of baking. Bakers became skilled artisans, their knowledge of fermentation and dough handling becoming increasingly refined. They were no longer just grinding grain and baking flatbreads. They were mastering the subtle art of the rise, understanding how temperature, humidity, and the quality of their yeast affected the final product. It was a craft that required patience, observation, and a keen sense of timing. So, the consistent production of risen bread was far more than just a culinary improvement. It was a fundamental shift that underpinned the growth and stability of the Roman Empire. It fed its armies, sustained its cities, influenced its economy, and even shaped its social policies. The strange life hacks that made bread rise were, in essence, the silent engines of a civilization. So, the next time you enjoy a slice of fluffy bread, take a moment to appreciate the Roman ingenuity that through a series of accidental discoveries and a surprising detour into the world of beer, laid some of the earliest foundations for modern baking. They didn't have the scientific language to explain it, but they had the practical wisdom to harness the power of microscopic life. We've seen how Roman bread transformed society, but nothing lasts forever. The ancient world eventually gave way to new eras, and with them, new technologies and new ways of doing things. How did the Romans' peculiar baking secrets eventually fade? Giving way to more modern methods, you're about to witness the gradual evolution and eventual disappearance of these fascinating ancient techniques. The Roman quest for the perfect loaf continues, but with beer yeast in hand, they were well on their way. But what exactly was this bizarre secret ingredient that truly solidified their bread-making prowess? And how did it look when put into action in the bustling Roman bakeries you're about to find out? And it's even stranger than you think. You've witnessed the Roman Empire flourish, its vast population sustained by the humble loaf, now consistently risen thanks to ingenious, if sometimes bizarre, methods. You've seen how bread became a cornerstone of their daily life, their economy, and even their military might. But like all empires, and indeed all technologies, the Roman way of doing things was not immutable. The ancient world eventually gave way to new eras, and with them, new knowledge, new challenges, and new ways of making bread. The peculiar baking secrets of the Romans, once cutting-edge innovations, would gradually fade, giving way to more modern methods. You've seen the Roman baker, his brow furrowed, his muscles aching, slowly discovering the magic of sourdough, then making a significant leap by harnessing the frothy power of beer yeast. The bread is getting better, lighter, more consistent. But the story of Roman leavening isn't quite finished yet. There's one more twist, one more truly bizarre ingredient that, for a time, became a secret weapon in their quest for the perfect rise. It's the kind of thing that, if you heard it at a modern dinner party, you'd probably spit out your wine. Imagine yourself now drifting through the centuries that followed the height of Roman power. The empire, once so vast and seemingly eternal, begins its slow, inexorable decline. Cities shrink, trade routes become less secure, and the centralized organization that once ensured a steady supply of grain and a thriving baking industry starts to unravel. This fragmentation had a profound impact on daily life, including something as fundamental as bread production. Imagine yourself now not in a bakery or a tavern, but near a Roman slaughterhouse or macellum. The air is, well, it's not pleasant. It's thick with the metallic tang of blood, the earthy smell of animal hides, and the faint, sweet scent of entrails. Not exactly the kind of place you'd associate with delicious bread, is it? But the Romans were nothing if not resourceful, and they had a knack for finding value in unexpected places. They wasted nothing, or at least they tried not to. The common historical fact here is that with the decline of the Western Roman Empire, many of the large-scale specialized bakeries and the sophisticated grain supply chains that characterized Roman cities either disappeared or became localized. The grand pistrina that once churned out thousands of loaves a day for the urban masses were often replaced by smaller, more localized operations, or even a return to household baking. The era of mass-produced, consistently risen bread, at least in its Roman form, began to wane. Among the various byproducts of animal slaughter, there was one particular substance that caught the attention of some very clever, or perhaps very desperate, Roman bakers. This substance was the blood of sacrificial animals, particularly the blood of pigs, mixed with millet or other grains, then left to ferment. Yes, you heard that right. Blood. As a leavening agent, it sounds utterly repulsive to our modern sensibilities, a culinary nightmare. But in ancient Rome, and where every part of an animal was used, and where the line between food and medicine, or food and ritual, was often blurred, it was simply another resource. As urban centers diminished, so too did the demand for the kind of consistent, large batch leavening that beer yeast and, certainly, fermented blood paste provided. People began to rely more on what was readily available and easily maintained. This often meant a resurgence of the older, more self-sufficient methods. The sourdough starter, that original accidental discovery, became king once more. It was simpler to maintain in a household setting, requiring only flour and water. and could be passed down through generations without needing a connection to a commercial brewery or slaughterhouse. You can picture a medieval peasant carefully tending their bubbling sourdough, a direct descendant of those earliest Roman experiments. It's like going from a big centralized factory back to a local artisanal workshop, different scale, different methods. The process was, by all accounts, quite involved. You take fresh pig's blood, which was readily available from sacrifices or regular butchering. To this, you'd add fine millet flour or some other grain. Perhaps even a bit of wine or grape must to kickstart fermentation. This mixture would then be kneaded into a dough-like consistency and left to ferment, often in warm conditions. As the mixture fermented, it would bubble and swell, much like a sourdough starter or beer yeast. The resulting fermented blood and grain paste, known as fermentum, was then used to leaven bread. It's a bit like a very old, very gross version of a pre-ferment. It makes you wonder what kind of desperate culinary experiments they were running, doesn't it? You probably wouldn't survive a single bite of that bread. The knowledge of how to use beer foam effectively for baking likely persisted in regions where brewing remained strong, particularly in parts of Northern Europe. But the highly organized system of collecting and distributing this byproduct, so prevalent in Roman cities, would have become less common. The use of fermented blood paste, already a niche and somewhat unsettling method, would have likely dwindled even faster. As societies became more Christianized, the ritualistic aspects of animal sacrifice, which often provided the blood, diminished, further reducing its availability as a leavening agent. Plus, let's be honest, it probably wasn't the most appealing option anyway. This, my friends, is the truly bizarre secret ingredient, the use of a fermented paste made from animal blood and grain as a leavening agent. This is a common historical fact, documented by ancient writers like Pliny the Elder and Cato the Elder, though it's often glossed over in modern accounts of Roman cuisine for obvious reasons. It's not exactly appetizing to think about, but it highlights the Romans' relentless pursuit of effective leavening, even if it meant venturing into the truly unconventional. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, the specific types of grains cultivated also shifted over time, influencing the characteristics of bread. As new agricultural practices emerged and different climates became more dominant, grains like rye and barley sometimes gained prominence over wheat, especially in Northern Europe. These grains have different gluten structures and fermentation needs, requiring bakers to adapt their techniques. A sourdough starter that worked perfectly with Roman wheat might behave differently with medieval rye, leading to new experimentation and adaptation. It's like trying to bake a cake with a completely different type of flour. You can't just use the same recipe and expect the same results. Why blood? Well, blood is rich in proteins and sugars, which are excellent food sources for yeast and bacteria. When mixed with grain and left to ferment, it would have created a highly active, potent leavening agent. The fermentation process would have consumed many of the sugars and produced carbon dioxide, just like traditional yeast. And the strong flavors and aromas of the blood would have been largely masked or transformed by the fermentation and the baking process. Or at least, that was the hope. Imagine the conversations at the Roman dinner table. Honey, this bread has a lovely, earthy undertone. Wouldn't you say? This brings us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the extent to which Roman baking knowledge was truly lost versus simply transformed or localized during the early medieval period. Was there a complete break with Roman culinary traditions? Or did elements of their sophisticated techniques persist in fragmented forms, passed down through monastic communities or isolated regions? The archaeological record and surviving texts are often sparse for this period, making it difficult to trace the precise lineage of baking practices. It's like trying to follow a single thread through a very old, very tattered tapestry. Some parts are clear, others are completely missing. This method was particularly prevalent in certain regions and for specific types of bread, especially those used in religious ceremonies or for special occasions. It wasn't necessarily for your everyday loaf, though it certainly could have been. It speaks to a certain pragmatism that bordered on the extreme. The Romans were not squeamish. They lived in a world where life and death, sacrifice and sustenance were intimately intertwined. As the centuries progressed, new forms of leavening began to emerge, slowly but surely displacing the ancient Roman methods. The most significant of these was the gradual development of what we now recognize as brewer's yeast, specifically cultivated for baking, rather than just as a byproduct of beer. This was a slow process, involving observation and selection, but it eventually led to more predictable and powerful leavening agents. Imagine yourself now, not as a tiny observer, but as a Roman citizen waking up in the morning. For centuries, your breakfast might have been a bowl of dense pulse or a piece of hard, unleavened bread that required significant effort to chew. But now, thanks to the reliable leavening provided by sourdough, beer yeast, or even that unsettling blood paste, your daily bread is consistently lighter, more palatable, and more digestible. This seemingly small change had a profound impact on individual well-being. Less effort chewing meant less wear and tear on teeth, a significant benefit in an era without modern dentistry. Easier digestion meant more energy, less discomfort. It was a subtle but powerful improvement to the quality of daily life. A constant, comforting presence at every meal. The scientific revolution, centuries later, would finally unravel the mystery of yeast, identifying it as a living microorganism responsible for fermentation. This understanding, pioneered by scientists like Louis Pasteur in the 19th century, transformed baking from an empirical art into a science. Once bakers understood why yeast worked, they could cultivate it, control it, and eventually produce it commercially in standardized forms. This was the death knell for the more peculiar Roman methods. Why bother with fermented blood or inconsistent beer dregs when you could buy a packet of reliable, active dry yeast? It's like going from trying to start your car with a crank to just turning a key, infinitely easier and more reliable. This brings us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the exact prevalence and sensory impact of blood-leavened bread in Roman society. Was it a widespread practice or a niche technique? Did the resulting bread have a distinct flavor or aroma that would be noticeable to the average Roman palate? While ancient texts mention the practice, they don't always provide detailed sensory descriptions. Modern attempts to recreate such a bread are rare and often met with understandable reluctance. It's a culinary mystery, a forgotten flavor profile that remains largely unexplored. The Industrial Revolution further accelerated this shift. Mass production of flour, standardized ovens, and the widespread availability of commercial yeast meant that baking could be done on an unprecedented scale, with consistent results. The need for those strange, ancient life hacks simply vanished. They were clever solutions for a world without scientific understanding, but they couldn't compete with the precision and efficiency of modern microbiology and industrial production. The use of blood as a leavening agent highlights the Roman ingenuity in a stark and perhaps unsettling way. They were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the resources they had. They understood, on a practical level, that fermentation was key to transforming their dense grains into something lighter, and they were willing to experiment with almost anything to achieve that goal. It's a testament to their resourcefulness, even if it makes us a little queasy. You can imagine the Roman baker, transported through time, looking at a modern supermarket shelf filled with different types of yeast. They'd probably be utterly bewildered, perhaps even a little horrified. Where's the beer foam? Where's the other stuff? They might ask, utterly baffled by the simplicity and efficacy of a tiny packet. It's a testament to how far culinary science has come, building on centuries of empirical knowledge, even the strange and forgotten bits. You can imagine the Roman baker and his hands stained with flour and perhaps a hint of something else, carefully tending to his fermenting blood and grain paste. It would have been a delicate balance, ensuring the right temperature and conditions for the fermentation to occur without the mixture simply putrefying. There would have been a distinct smell, certainly, a combination of fermentation and something more, primal. But for the Romans, it was the smell of progress, the scent of a lighter loaf. Even today, echoes of Roman baking persist. Sourdough bread, for instance, has seen a massive resurgence, a testament to the enduring appeal of natural fermentation and the complex flavors it produces. While we don't use fermented blood, thankfully, the principle of using a live culture to leaven bread is still very much alive. The techniques have been refined, the ingredients purified, but the underlying biological process remains the same. The introduction of this bizarre leavening agent, alongside the more conventional beer yeast and sourdough, meant that Roman bakers had a wider array of tools at their disposal. They could choose the method that best suited their needs, their ingredients, and the type of bread they wanted to produce. For everyday consumption, beer yeast or sourdough might have been sufficient. But for special occasions, or when a particularly strong rise was desired, the fermented blood paste offered a unique, if unsettling, alternative. The fading of these ancient methods wasn't a sudden event but a gradual process, driven by changing social structures, economic realities, and eventually, scientific progress. The Roman peculiar baking secrets were brilliant innovations for their time, born of necessity and ingenuity. But as the world moved on, so too did the methods of making bread, leaving these fascinating historical footnotes behind. This period of Roman baking was a fascinating blend of tradition and innovation. They clung to their ancient grains and their simple ovens, but they were also open to new ideas, even those that seemed outlandish. The pursuit of a better loaf was a driving force, pushing them to experiment with everything from accidental sourdough to the byproducts of their breweries and slaughterhouses. It's a reminder that culinary history is often a story of trial, error, and unexpected discoveries. So, the next time you hold a soft, airy loaf, remember the long and winding road it took to get there. From the dense bricks of early Rome to the sophisticated, scientifically understood breads of today. The journey of leavening is a story of human ingenuity, accidental discoveries, and the slow, inevitable march of progress. The strange life hacks of the Romans may be gone, but their legacy, in the very act of baking, continues to live on. The Roman fascination with bread was not just about making it rise, it was also about its texture and appearance. A lighter, airier bread was not only easier to eat, but also looked more appealing. It was a sign of a skilled baker, a mark of quality. And in a society that valued appearances, even the humble loaf of bread was subject to aesthetic considerations. We've reached the penultimate chapter, witnessing the disappearance of ancient techniques. But what about their enduring impact? How do these ancient Roman innovations, even the bizarre ones, continue to echo in modern baking? You're about to reflect on the lasting, often unseen, legacy of Roman ingenuity in our culinary world. So, while the idea of blood-leavened bread might send shivers down your spine, it was, for the Romans, a testament to their resourcefulness and their relentless pursuit of culinary improvement. They were the ultimate DIY bakers, using whatever was at hand to achieve their goals. You've witnessed the rise and fall of Roman baking techniques, from the accidental tang of sourdough to the unsettling efficacy of fermented blood, and finally, their gradual displacement by modern science and industry. You've seen how these strange life hacks were born of necessity and ingenuity, serving their purpose in a world without microscopes or commercial yeast. But even though these specific methods have largely vanished from our kitchens, their legacy, often unseen, continues to echo in the bread you eat today. Now that we've explored the strange ingredients, let's step into the bustling heart of Roman baking. How did these bizarre leavening agents actually get used? What did a Roman bakery look like, sound like, and smell like when this unusual technique was in full swing? You're about to witness the ancient Roman bread-making process firsthand. And it's a sensory experience you won't soon forget. Imagine yourself now, back in your own time, perhaps standing in a modern bakery or supermarket aisle. The air is filled with the comforting, familiar scent of freshly baked bread. You pick up a soft, airy loaf, its crust golden, its interior light and fluffy. This seemingly simple act is, in fact, the culmination of millennia of human endeavor, a direct lineage stretching back to those determined Roman bakers. You've journeyed through the subtle tang of early sourdough, the frothy power of beer yeast, and even the unsettling efficacy of fermented blood. Your stomach might be doing a few flips at the thought of that last one. But remember, for the Romans, it was simply a tool in their relentless pursuit of a better loaf. Now, with these strange and wonderful, or wonderfully strange leavening agents in hand, it's time to step into the heart of the Roman Empire's culinary engine, the bustling, smoky, and surprisingly sophisticated Roman bakery. The common historical fact here is that the fundamental principles of leavening, the use of yeast to produce carbon dioxide gas that makes dough rise, remain unchanged from ancient times to today. While the Romans didn't understand the microbiology, they intuitively grasped the process. They knew that a living agent was needed to transform their dense grain into something lighter. Every time you see bread rise, you're witnessing the same biological miracle that baffled and delighted Roman bakers. It's like the basic laws of physics. They were true then, and they're true now, even if our understanding of them has evolved dramatically. Imagine yourself standing on the threshold of a pastrinum, the Roman term for a commercial bakery. It's not the quaint, artisanal shop you might envision today, with glass display cases and the gentle hum of modern machinery. No, this is a place of serious industry, a workshop designed for volume and efficiency. The first thing that hits you is the heat, radiating from massive brick ovens that dominate the space. Then comes the smell of a complex tapestry of warm grain, wood smoke, and that distinct, slightly sour aroma of fermenting dough. It's a smell that speaks of hard work, of sustenance, and of a civilization that ran on bread. Think about the sourdough craze that swept the world in recent years. Remember that ancient Roman sourdough starter, carefully maintained and passed down. That very same principle is at play in every artisan bakery producing sourdough today. The natural yeasts and bacteria, cultivated from the air and flour, are still doing their work, creating complex flavors and a unique texture. While we use precise measurements and controlled environments, the essence is the same, harnessing wild microbes to leaven our bread. It's a direct callback to those accidental discoveries made by tired Roman bakers millennia ago. You might even be feeding your own sourdough starter right now, unknowingly participating in a culinary tradition that predates empires. You step inside, and your senses are immediately overwhelmed. The air is thick with flour dust, catching the shafts of sunlight that pierce through high windows or open doorways, making the whole place shimmer. The rhythmic thud of pestles against mortars echoes from one corner, where grain is being laboriously ground into flour. In another, you hear the slap and squish of dough being kneaded, a constant, almost hypnotic sound. This isn't a quiet place, it's a symphony of labor, a testament to the sheer physical effort required to feed a city. Even the commercial yeast you buy in packets owes a debt to Roman observation. Remember how they discovered the potent leavening power of beer foam? That was an early empirical understanding of brewer's yeast? Modern commercial yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is essentially a highly refined and standardized descendant of those wild yeasts that thrived in Roman breweries. Scientists simply isolated the most effective strains, cultivated them, and made them widely available. So, every time you use a packet of active dry yeast, you're tapping into a lineage that includes those resourceful Roman brewers and bakers. It's like they laid the groundwork, and we just got better at mass production. The baker, often a freedman or a slave, is a figure of immense strength and endurance. You watch as he, or perhaps she, wrestles with enormous quantities of dough in large wooden troughs. Forget your KitchenAid mixer. This is all muscle. Arms ripple, sweat beads on foreheads, and the dough, stiff and resistant, gradually yields to their powerful kneading. This process, known as patere, was crucial for developing the gluten structure in the dough, allowing it to trap the gases produced by the leavening and achieve a better rise. It's a workout that would put your modern gym routine to shame. You'd probably pull a muscle just watching. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, the Roman practice of scoring bread before baking, which you saw in the bustling pastrina, is still a common technique in modern baking. Those decorative slashes on the top of a loaf aren't just for aesthetics. They serve a crucial purpose. They allow the dough to expand predictably during oven spring, preventing uncontrolled tearing of the crust. This practice, likely developed through centuries of trial and error in ancient bakeries, ensures a better rise and a more visually appealing loaf. It's a small detail, easily overlooked, but it's a direct link to the practical wisdom of Roman bakers. You're basically doing what a Roman baker did thousands of years ago, just with a sharper blade. Once the dough is sufficiently kneaded, it's time for the magic to happen. This is where those previously discussed leavening agents come into play. If it's a common, everyday loaf, you'd see a portion of the previous day's dough, the sourdough starter, being kneaded in, or more reliably, a baker would be carefully adding a scoop of the frothy, pungent beer yeast, perhaps acquired from a nearby brewery, for special, perhaps ritualistic, breads. You might even glimpse the unsettling sight of the fermented blood and grain paste being incorporated. The goal is the same: introduce those microscopic workers, the yeast, to their new carbohydrate buffet. This brings us to a point of ongoing academic debate. Scholars still debate the full extent to which Roman bread-making techniques, particularly the more sophisticated ones, influenced medieval and Renaissance European baking. Was there a continuous, unbroken chain of knowledge? Or were there periods of significant loss and rediscovery, while the general principles of leavening certainly persisted? The specific nuances of Roman flour types, oven designs, and leavening agents might have been partially forgotten or adapted beyond recognition. It's like trying to trace the precise influence of an ancient language on a modern one. Some words are clearly related. Others have evolved so much they're unrecognizable. The dough, now inoculated with its leavening agent, is left to rest and rise. This is the fermentation stage, a critical period where the yeast consumes sugars in the flour and produces carbon dioxide gas, creating those precious bubbles that give bread its lightness. The Roman bakers, without understanding the science, knew that warmth was key. You'd see the troughs of dough placed near the ovens, or in specially heated rooms, to encourage the yeast to work its magic. The dough would slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, begin to swell, transforming from a dense lump into a softer, more pliable mass. It's a slow dance, a patient wait, but the anticipation of a lighter loaf makes it worthwhile. Consider the sheer scale of Roman bread production. The concept of mass-producing a staple food for an entire city, as seen in Rome and Pompeii, laid an early foundation for industrial food production. While their methods were labor-intensive, the organizational principles, specialized bakeries, efficient grinding mills, and a complex distribution network foreshadowed the industrial bakeries of later centuries. The Romans understood the logistics of feeding a large population, a challenge that remains central to modern food systems. This brings us to a common historical fact. Roman bakeries, particularly in larger cities like Rome and Pompeii, were often highly organized and specialized operations. They weren't just small, family-run affairs. Many were large-scale establishments, sometimes employing dozens of workers, designed to mass-produce bread for the city's population. The famous bakery of Modestus in Pompeii, for example, features multiple grinding mills, large kneading rooms, and massive ovens, clearly indicating a sophisticated industrial-scale operation. These were the factories of the ancient world, churning out the daily bread that fueled an empire. Even the variety of bread types, from coarse whole-grain loaves for the poor to refined white bread for the elite, finds its echo in today's diverse bread market. We still have our everyday sandwich bread, our artisanal sourdoughs, our rustic whole-grain loaves, and our delicate brioches. The Roman desire for different textures, flavors, and qualities of bread, reflecting social status and culinary preference, continues to drive innovation in the baking world. As the dough rises, it's then divided and shaped. You'd see skilled hands quickly portioning the dough, forming it into various shapes. The most common was the round loaf, often scored with lines to make it easy to break into portions, a practice that continues in some traditional breads today. Some loaves might be shaped into rings, or even more elaborate forms for special occasions. The speed and precision with which the bakers worked, their movements fluid and practiced, would be mesmerizing. They were artists in their own right, shaping the very sustenance of their society. The Roman emphasis on grain cultivation and storage also left a lasting mark. Their vast granaries and efficient shipping routes were essential for feeding their empire. This focus on securing a stable grain supply and the infrastructure to support it established precedents for agricultural policies and trade networks that would evolve throughout history. The very idea of a breadbasket region, like the American Midwest or the Canadian prairies, has its conceptual roots in the Roman reliance on regions like Egypt for their grain. Now, for a slightly obscure detail, Roman bakers often marked their loaves with a unique stamp or seal before baking. This wasn't just for decoration. These stamps could indicate the baker's identity, the type of flour used, or even the intended recipient of the bread. It was an early form of branding, a way to ensure quality control and accountability. Imagine a Roman citizen complaining about a particularly dense loaf, and the baker being able to identify it by its unique mark. It's like an ancient QR code, but far less convenient for scanning. It also makes you wonder if there were ancient Roman food critics, leaving scathing reviews of stamped yet stubbornly flat loaves. You can imagine a Roman baker, somehow transported to a modern baking school, watching a student meticulously weigh ingredients, check dough temperature with a thermometer, and use a proofing box for a perfect rise. They'd be astonished by the precision and control, but then they might see the student shape a round loaf, score it with a blade, and slide it into a hot oven, and a flicker of recognition would cross their ancient face. Ah, they might think. Some things never change. The most dramatic part of the process, of course, was the baking itself. The Roman ovens were massive, wood-fired structures built from brick or stone. They were heated by burning wood inside the oven chamber until the walls were scorching hot. Once the desired temperature was reached, the embers and ash would be raked out, and the loaves, carefully placed on long wooden peels, would be slid into the inferno. The heat would be intense, immediately setting the crust and causing the dough to undergo its final dramatic rise. The oven spring, the strange life hacks of the Romans, the accidental sourdough, the beer foam, and yes, even the unsettling fermented blood were not just historical curiosities. They were vital steps in humanity's long journey to master the art of baking. Each experiment, each observation, each success and failure contributed to the collective knowledge that eventually led to the diverse and delicious breads we enjoy today. You'd hear the crackle of the wood, the hiss of the dough hitting the hot stone, and then, slowly, the rich, intoxicating aroma of baking bread would begin to fill the air. This is the smell that truly makes your mouth water. The scent of transformation, of raw ingredients becoming something delicious and comforting. It's a smell that transcends time, connecting you directly to the daily lives of these ancient people. So, the next time you break open a fresh loaf, take a moment, feel its texture, inhale its aroma, savor its taste. And as you do, remember the invisible threads connecting you to those ancient Roman bakers, to their ingenuity, their perseverance, and their surprising, sometimes bizarre, life hacks that made bread rise. Their legacy isn't just in history books, it's in every delicious bite. You have listened to the stories of the ancient Romans' bread-making secrets. Let the images of bustling bakeries, the scent of yeast, and even the strangeness of fermenting blood fade into the night. As you drift off to sleep, remember that even the most ordinary things in our lives have a rich history, full of surprises and strange inventions. Let your breathing become steady, your mind become calm, and your dreams be filled with the whispers of history. The baking time would vary depending on the size and type of the loaf. But the bakers, through years of experience, would know exactly when the bread was perfectly done. They'd pull the golden brown loaves from the oven, their crusts crisp and their interiors soft and airy by Roman standards. At least, the bread would be stacked, still warm, ready to be distributed to the hungry masses.